The thunderous sound of hooves pounding against the hard, packed earth echoed through the valley as Olivia Prescott's screams pierced the evening air. Her auburn hair tangled painfully in the fist of her attacker as he dragged her from the modest homestead she'd called home for the past year. Dust clouded her vision as she clawed desperately at the ground, seeking purchase against the brutal force pulling her away from everything she had built. "Let her go, Daniels." The commanding voice cut through her terror like a blade. Through tear-blurred eyes, Olivia saw a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, a Winchester rifle leveled steadily at her attacker. The man who had been dragging her suddenly released his grip, and she collapsed into the dirt, gasping for breath. "This ain't your business, Vaughn," the attacker snarled. "This woman's on my land." Vaughn Drake stepped closer, his shadow falling across Olivia's crumpled form. "We both know that's a lie, Daniels. This parcel was deeded fair and square. Now get on your horse and ride out before I decide to make you." Wyoming Territory, 1875, was no place for the faint of heart, and certainly no place for a woman alone. But Olivia had never considered herself faint of heart, not even when her husband had died 6 months into their journey west, leaving her to continue on alone to claim the land that was supposed to be their fresh start. Jasper Daniels, owner of the neighboring Diamond D Ranch, had been trying to intimidate her off her property since the day she'd arrived. Today, he had finally resorted to violence. "This ain't over," Daniels threatened, backing toward his horse. "No woman can work this land alone. You'll be begging to sell by winter." "I said ride out." Vaughn's deep voice held no room for argument. His rifle remained steady until Daniels mounted his horse and disappeared over the ridge. Only then did the tall cowboy lower his weapon and turn his attention to Olivia. She had managed to push herself to her knees, frantically trying to smooth down her torn dress and disheveled hair. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. "Madam," he said, his voice gentler now. "Are you hurt?" Olivia looked up at her rescuer. Vaughn Drake was known throughout the county as a man who kept to himself, working as a hired gun for the stage company and occasionally helping neighboring ranchers with their cattle. His face was weathered from years under the harsh western sun, his eyes the piercing blue of a high mountain lake. "Nothing that won't heal," she managed, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Drake." He extended a hand to help her up. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Mrs. Prescott," her chin lifted defiantly. "This is my land, Mr. Drake. I have nowhere else to go and no one to rely on but myself." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Admirable but foolish. Daniels won't be deterred so easily. He's had his eye on this valley for years." Olivia brushed the dust from her skirts, wincing as her bruised scalp throbbed. "What would you have me do? Abandon everything my husband and I dreamed of?" Vaughn glanced at the small cabin, its door still hanging open from where Daniels had dragged her out. The vegetable garden to the side showed signs of careful tending, and a small corral held 2 horses and a milk cow. "You've done well for yourself," he acknowledged. "But Daniels has men working for him who won't hesitate to do his bidding, even if it means burning you out." A chill ran through Olivia at his words. "Are you suggesting I sell to him after all?" "No." Vaughn's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding hills. "I'm suggesting you need protection until the marshal can sort this out." Olivia followed his gaze to the distant ridgeline, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. "I can't afford to hire a gun." "I'm not offering my services for money, Mrs. Prescott." He tipped his hat. "I owe your late husband a debt I can never repay. The least I can do is ensure his widow isn't run off her rightful property." Confusion furrowed her brow. "You knew Thomas. We served together during the war." A shadow crossed his face. "He saved my life at Antietam." Olivia studied him with new interest. Thomas had rarely spoken of his time in the war, the memories too painful to revisit. "He never mentioned you." "Some things are best left in the past." Vaughn shouldered his rifle. "I'll bring my bedroll and sleep in your barn tonight. Daniels might decide to return with reinforcements." Before she could protest, he had already turned toward his horse, a magnificent dapple gray that stood patiently nearby. "Lock your door, Mrs. Prescott. I'll keep watch." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Olivia retreated to the safety of her cabin. Through the window, she watched Vaughn settle his horse in the small barn, his movements efficient and purposeful. She wondered what kind of debt he felt he owed Thomas, and why her husband had never spoken of this stoic cowboy. The night passed without incident, though Olivia barely slept, her scalp still tender from Daniel's rough handling and her mind racing with questions about the stranger keeping watch over her property. At dawn, she rose to find Vaughn already awake, building a fire outside to boil coffee. "Good morning, Mrs. Prescott," he greeted her, his voice carrying in the still morning air. No sign of trouble during the night, Olivia approached, carrying a basket of eggs she'd gathered from her small henhouse. "You must be hungry. Please join me for breakfast." "It's the least I can offer for your protection." Inside her modest cabin, Olivia busied herself preparing a simple meal of eggs and biscuits. Vaughn sat somewhat awkwardly at her table, his tall frame making the small space seem even smaller. His hat rested on his knee, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "How long have you been in Wyoming Territory?" she asked, setting a plate before him, going on 10 years now. Vaughn accepted the food gratefully. "Came west after the war, looking for a fresh start like so many others. Yet you never settled in one place," a shadow crossed his face, "never found a reason to put down roots." Olivia sat across from him with her own plate. "And what brought you to my aid yesterday?" "Surely not just a debt to a man long dead." Vaughn's blue eyes met hers directly. "I've been keeping an eye on you since I heard Thomas Prescott's widow had claimed his land. Daniels has been pushing out smaller ranchers for years. I knew it was only a matter of time before he turned his attention to you. So you've been watching me." Olivia wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or disturbed by this revelation, from a distance. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I didn't want to intrude on your grief." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Vaughn was instantly alert, setting down his fork and reaching for the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he commanded softly, moving to the window to peer out, his posture relaxed slightly. "It's Marshal Winters." Olivia opened the door to find the aging lawman on her doorstep, his expression grim beneath his thick white mustache. "Mrs. Prescott, I heard about yesterday's incident. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Marshal, thanks to Mr. Drake's intervention." The Marshal nodded to Vaughn, who had positioned himself protectively near Olivia. "Drake, good to see you involved. Mrs. Prescott needs friends in these parts." "Daniels needs to be arrested," Vaughn stated flatly. "He assaulted Mrs. Prescott on her own property." Marshal Winters sighed heavily. "It's not that simple. Daniels is claiming this land rightfully belongs to him, that the deed Thomas Prescott filed was fraudulent." Olivia gasped. "That's preposterous. Thomas purchased this land legally before we ever left Missouri." "I believe you, madam," the marshal assured her. "But Daniels has influence with Judge Parker. He's managed to get a temporary injunction until the matter can be settled in court." "When will that be?" Vaughn demanded. "Circuit judge won't be through for another 3 weeks at least." The marshal looked apologetically at Olivia. "Until then, the law says this property is in dispute. So Daniels is free to continue harassing me." Olivia's voice rose in indignation. "Officially, neither of you should be occupying the property during the dispute," the marshal explained. "But I know you have nowhere else to go, Mrs. Prescott. Just be careful. Daniels plays by his own rules." After the marshal departed, Olivia sank into a chair, her face pale. 3 weeks. How am I supposed to protect myself for 3 weeks? Vaughn remained standing, his expression thoughtful. "You won't have to do it alone." Olivia looked up at him, surprised. "You can't stay here that long. You have your own work, your own life. The stage company can spare me for a few weeks." His jaw was set in determination. "I won't let Daniels drive you off this land." Over the next days, Vaughn proved as good as his word. He continued to sleep in the barn, but spent his days helping Olivia with the heavier work around the homestead, repairing fences, reinforcing the barn door, and keeping watch for any sign of Daniels or his men. Olivia found herself watching him as he worked, his capable hands moving with surprising grace for such a large man. Despite his initial gruffness, she discovered he was well-read and thoughtful, often discussing books from her small collection during their evening meals. A week into his stay, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Olivia finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What happened between you and Thomas at Antietam? You said he saved your life." Vaughn was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "We were pinned down in a cornfield, taking heavy fire. I'd been hit in the leg, couldn't move. Thomas came back for me when everyone else was retreating, carried me on his back while bullets flew all around us." His hands clasped tightly together. "He had no reason to risk his life that way. We weren't even from the same company, just two soldiers who'd shared coffee a few times." Olivia felt tears prick her eyes. That sounded like the Thomas she had known, brave and selfless to a fault. "That's why you're helping me now." Vaughn turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "At first, yes, but now—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Now I'm helping because I want to, Olivia, because you deserve to keep this land you've worked so hard for." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in her chest fluttered at the sound of it on his lips. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distant sound of gunfire. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, pushing Olivia toward the door. "Get inside. Stay low." Heart racing, she complied, watching through the window as Vaughn retrieved his rifle from the barn and took up a position behind the water trough. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the darkening sky. "That's far enough," Vaughn's voice carried across the yard. "This is private property," one of the riders called back. "We've come with a message from Mr. Daniels. He says the lady has 2 days to clear out, or he won't be responsible for what happens. Tell Daniels if he wants this land, he can wait for the court's decision like a law-abiding citizen." Vaughn's rifle remained trained on the men. A shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Vaughn's position. He returned fire, his bullet whistling close enough to one rider to make the man's horse rear in panic. The 3 quickly retreated back over the ridge. When Vaughn returned to the cabin, his expression was grim. "They'll be back, and in greater numbers next time." Olivia's hands trembled as she lit the lamp. "What are we going to do?" "We need help." Vaughn paced the small room. "I know some men from my days with the stage company who'd stand with us if asked, good men who won't be intimidated by Daniels." "I can't ask strangers to risk their lives for my property," Olivia protested. "Not strangers, friends." Vaughn stopped pacing to look at her. "And not just for your property, for what's right." The next morning, Vaughn rode out, promising to return by nightfall with reinforcements. Olivia spent the day in anxious preparation, baking extra bread and preparing a stew large enough to feed several hungry men. She also loaded her husband's old shotgun and kept it within reach at all times. True to his word, Vaughn returned as the sun was setting, accompanied by 4 hard-looking men. He introduced them as former stage guards and ranch hands who had their own reasons to dislike Jasper Daniels. They set up camp near the barn, their presence an immediate comfort to Olivia. That night, as she and Vaughn sat at her table discussing plans for defense, a different kind of tension filled the air between them. Their hands accidentally touched as they both reached for the coffee pot, and neither pulled away immediately. "Olivia," Vaughn said softly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up, caught by the intensity in his blue eyes. "Yes, when this is over, when your land is secure." He hesitated, then pushed on. "I'd like to call on you properly, if you'd allow it." Heat rushed to Olivia's cheeks. "Mr. Drake, Vaughn, please." "Vaughn," she amended, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still in mourning for my husband. I know, and I respect that." His eyes held her steadily. "I'm not asking for anything now. Just permission to hope that someday, when you're ready, you might consider me worthy of your attention." Before she could respond, shouts from outside shattered the moment. One of Vaughn's men burst through the door. Riders coming, at least a dozen of them. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, guiding Olivia toward the back of the cabin. "Stay down and away from the windows. This could get ugly." From her position, Olivia could hear the approaching hoofbeats and men shouting. Vaughn's deep voice rang out, demanding that the intruders identify themselves. "It's Daniels," came the reply. "I've come for what's mine. Send the woman out, and no one needs to get hurt." Vaughn's answer was immediate and firm. This land belongs to Mrs. Prescott, and she's not going anywhere. The court will decide if there's any dispute to settle. Courts move too slow for my liking, Daniels shouted back. I'm taking this valley tonight. The first shot came from Daniels' side, followed immediately by a volley of gunfire from both directions. Olivia crouched lower, her heart pounding as bullets thudded into the wooden walls of her cabin. Through a crack in the shutters, she could see Vaughn and his men taking cover behind her corral and water trough, returning fire with deadly accuracy. The firefight seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Gradually, the shooting from Daniels' men became less frequent, and Olivia heard cursing and the sound of retreating hooves. Then a new sound, a cry of pain that she recognized immediately as Vaughn's voice. Forgetting all caution, Olivia grabbed her shotgun and rushed to the door. In the yard, Vaughn was on one knee, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Vaughn!" She ran to him as the last of Daniels' men disappeared over the ridge. "I'm all right," he grimaced, though his face was pale in the moonlight. "Bullet just grazed me." One of Vaughn's men approached, his expression grim. "We got 2 of them, including Daniels' foreman. The rest rode off, but they'll be back once they regroup." Inside the cabin, Olivia tended to Vaughn's wound, her fingers trembling as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder. "This is more than a graze," she scolded gently. "You could have been killed." His hand caught hers, stilling her movements. It was worth the risk. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Olivia felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to acknowledge the possibility of feeling something for another man. The moment was interrupted by one of Vaughn's men calling from outside. They had spotted a lone rider approaching, carrying a white flag. Vaughn insisted on going out to meet the messenger, despite Olivia's protests. She watched anxiously from the doorway as he walked to the edge of the property, rifle in hand. The messenger was one of Daniels' cowboys, a young man barely out of his teens. "Mr. Daniels says to tell you he's going to the marshal. Says you ambushed his men when they came to deliver a legal notice." Vaughn's laugh was without humor. "Tell Daniels the marshal knows exactly what kind of legal notice involves shooting at a homestead, and tell him his foreman can confirm our side of the story if he lives long enough to talk." The young cowboy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "There's more. He says to tell the woman that if she leaves now, he'll let her take her personal belongings. Otherwise, he ain't responsible for what happens next. You tell Daniels that Mrs. Prescott isn't going anywhere," Vaughn replied firmly, "and neither am I." After the messenger departed, Olivia and Vaughn's men held a council of war. It was decided that 2 men would ride to town immediately to inform Marshal Winters of what had happened, while the others would strengthen the defenses around the property. That night, Olivia insisted that Vaughn sleep in the cabin to rest his wounded shoulder. She made him a pallet near the hearth, though he protested that he was well enough to keep watch. "You've done enough," she told him firmly. "Let your friends take the first watch. You need rest to heal." Reluctantly, he agreed. As Olivia prepared for bed herself, she found her thoughts in turmoil. The events of the past weeks had awakened feelings she had thought buried with Thomas. Vaughn's steady presence, his quiet strength, and unwavering support had become increasingly important to her. She was awakened before dawn by urgent voices outside. Throwing on a shawl, she found Vaughn already at the door, speaking with one of his men who had just returned from town. "Marshals gathered a posse," the man was saying. "They're heading to Daniels' ranch now. Seems one of his wounded men admitted Daniels has been planning to drive you off since before you even arrived. Had some scheme going with the land office clerk to claim the deed was never properly filed." Relief washed over Olivia. "So it's over," the man shook his head. "Not quite. Daniels wasn't at his ranch. Marshall thinks he might try one last desperate move before the law catches up with him." As if to confirm his words, a shout came from one of the lookouts. "Fire! They're setting fire to the north pasture." In the pre-dawn light, Olivia could see orange flames beginning to lick across her grass, driven by the wind toward the homestead. Vaughn immediately began barking orders, sending men to harness the horses and bring water buckets. "We need to dig a fire break before it reaches the buildings," he explained to Olivia, already moving toward the barn. "Get whatever valuables you can't bear to lose. If we can't stop it, we'll have to evacuate." Heart pounding, Olivia rushed back into the cabin. She quickly gathered Thomas's letters, her mother's locket, and the deed to the property, stuffing them into a small bag. Outside, Vaughn and his men were frantically digging a trench between the approaching flames and the homestead. The fire moved faster than anyone anticipated, driven by a sudden gust of wind. Smoke billowed across the property, making it hard to breathe or see. Olivia joined the bucket line, passing water from the well to the men fighting the edge of the blaze. Through the smoke, she suddenly spotted movement riders approaching from the east, using the fire as cover. "Vaughn, riders coming in," Vaughn whirled, squinting through the haze. "It's Daniels, get back to the cabin." Before she could move, a shot rang out and one of Vaughn's men fell. The others returned fire, but they were caught between fighting the fire and defending against the attack. In the confusion, Olivia didn't see Daniels himself until he was nearly upon her. His horse burst through the smoke, and he leaned down, grabbing her by the arm. "You've caused me enough trouble, woman," Olivia struggled, but his grip was like iron as he began to drag her toward his horse. "Let me go, this is my land." "Not anymore," Daniels snarled, his face twisted with rage and greed. "This valley is mine, and no one's going to stop me from taking it." He grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking painfully as he tried to force her onto his horse. Olivia screamed, clawing at his hands, her feet scrambling in the dirt. "Olivia," Vaughn's voice cut through the chaos. He appeared through the smoke like an avenging angel, his wounded shoulder forgotten as he lunged for Daniels. The two men crashed to the ground, Daniels releasing his grip on Olivia as they rolled in the dirt. Despite his injury, Vaughn fought with a controlled fury, his movements economical and deadly. Daniels, though, fought dirty, landing a vicious blow to Vaughn's wounded shoulder that made him grunt in pain. Taking advantage of Vaughn's momentary weakness, Daniels reached for his gun. Without thinking, Olivia grabbed a nearby shovel and swung it with all her might. The flat of the blade connected with Daniels' head with a sickening thud, and he collapsed. Vaughn looked up at her, surprise and admiration in his eyes. "Remind me never to make you angry." The sound of galloping horses heralded the arrival of Marshal Winters and his posse. They quickly took control of the situation, arresting Daniels' remaining men and helping to contain the fire before it could reach the buildings. Daniels himself, dazed but conscious, was handcuffed and loaded onto a horse. "This isn't over," he spat as the marshal led him away. "That land should have been mine." "It never was yours," Marshal Winters replied coldly. "And now you'll have plenty of time to think about that in territorial prison. Attempted murder, arson, assault, you'll be lucky to see daylight again in this lifetime." As the excitement died down, Olivia found herself standing amidst the charred remains of her north pasture. Nearly a quarter of her land was blackened, but the cabin and barn stood untouched. More importantly, she was still alive and her claim to the property was secure. Vaughn appeared at her side, his face streaked with soot, his injured shoulder now bleeding again through its bandage. "It could have been worse," he said quietly. "The land will recover by spring." Olivia turned to him, suddenly overcome with emotion. "You could have been killed, all of you, fighting for my property, not just for the property." His blue eyes held her steadily. "For you, Olivia." In that moment, with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air and the adrenaline of battle slowly fading, Olivia made a decision. She reached up and touched Vaughn's face gently, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "When you asked if you could call on me someday," she said softly, "I didn't give you an answer." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I recall that. My answer is yes." She took a deep breath. "Thomas has been gone for over a year now. I'll always love him, but I know he wouldn't want me to be alone forever." Vaughn's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring against her cheek. "I would never try to replace him in your heart, Olivia. I just hope there might be room for me there too someday." "I think," she said slowly, "that day might come sooner than either of us expected." 3 weeks later, Judge Parker arrived to officially settle the dispute over Olivia's land. With Daniels' confession and the testimony of the corrupt land office clerk, the case was quickly resolved in Olivia's favor. Her deed was confirmed as legitimate, and her ownership of the property was secured beyond any further challenge. The judge's visit coincided with the first snowfall of the season, a gentle dusting that transformed the burned pasture into a clean white expanse. Standing on her porch after the hearing, Olivia felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Vaughn joined her, his shoulder healing well after proper medical attention from the town doctor. He had taken a room at the boarding house in town while his friends returned to their own lives, but he rode out to the homestead nearly every day to help with repairs and preparations for winter. "Your land officially," he said, handing her the documents Judge Parker had signed. "No one can take it from you now." Olivia accepted the papers, but her mind was on other matters. "Vaughn, I've been thinking about the future." He waited patiently, his expression carefully neutral. "This is a lot of land for one person to manage," she continued, "and winters here are hard." "They are," he agreed, "but you've proven yourself more than capable." "Capable, yes, but perhaps not wise to continue alone." She turned to face him fully. "I find myself in need of a partner. Someone who understands this land, who would work alongside me rather than for me." Vaughn's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand her meaning. "Olivia, are you proposing a business arrangement?" A smile curved her lips. "Not exactly, or at least not only that." With a boldness that surprised even herself, Olivia stepped closer to him. "I'm proposing that you stay, Vaughn, not just for the winter but for good, as my husband if you're willing." For a moment he seemed stunned into silence. Then his face broke into a smile that transformed his usually solemn features. "I've been trying to find the courage to ask you the same thing," he admitted. "I just didn't want to rush you." "Life out here is too uncertain to waste time," Olivia said simply. "I know what I want, and it's you by my side." Vaughn took her hands in his. "Then yes, Olivia Prescott, I would be honored to be your husband, to work this land with you, and to build a life together." Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in town. Marshall Winters gave the bride away, and Vaughn's friends from the stage company stood as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but filled with genuine joy and hope for the future. As spring turned the blackened north pasture green again, Olivia and Vaughn Drake worked side by side to expand the homestead. They added a proper bedroom to the cabin, built a larger barn, and increased their herd of cattle. Vaughn's experience with horses proved valuable as they began breeding and training stock for the stage company and neighboring ranches. One evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the sunset, Vaughn wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Asking me to stay?" Olivia leaned into him, her hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach where their first child was beginning to make its presence known. "Not for a single moment. This land brought us together, but you're what makes it home." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind rustled through the tall grass of the valley that had nearly cost them everything, but instead had given them a new beginning. Through fire and violence, through courage and determination, they had found not just a piece of land to call their own, but a love strong enough to weather whatever challenges the frontier might bring.